spiel going. Welcome back to another reading of R.G. Collingwood's The Idea of History. For background music, I am putting on my record of Itzhak Perlman Anniversary Collection. It's got Itzhak Perlman and what's that guy's name? Isaac Stern. Sorry. And they're playing a variety of music. And I'll just start that now. And we are starting from page 40, subsection 10, character of Greco-Roman historiography, humanism. Greco-Roman historiography as a whole has firmly... Greco-Roman historiography as a whole has firmly grasped one at least of the four characteristics enumerated in the introduction. It is humanistic. It is a narrative of human history, the history of man's deeds, man's purposes, man's successes, and failures. It admits, no doubt, a divine agency, but the function of this agency is strictly limited. The will of the gods, as manifested in history, only appears rarely. In the best historians, hardly at all, and then only as a will supporting and seconding the will of man, and enabling him to succeed where otherwise he would have failed. The gods have no plan of their own for the development of human affairs. They only grant success or decree failure for the plans of men. This is why a more searching analysis of human actions themselves, discovering them alone in the grounds for their success or failure, tends to eliminate the gods altogether, and to substitute them for mere personifications of human activity. Like the genius of the emperor, the goddess of Rome, or the virtues represented on the Roman imperial coins, the ultimate development of this tendency is to find the cause of all historical events again in their personality, whether individual or corporate, of human agents. The philosophical idea underlying it is the idea of the human will, as freely choosing its own ends and limited in the success it achieves in the pursuit only by its own force, and by the power of the intellect which apprehends them, and works out the means to their achievement. This implies that whatever happens in history happens as a direct result of human will, that someone is directly responsible for it, to be praised or blamed according as it is a good or bad thing. Greco-Roman humanism, however, had a special weakness of its own, of its inadequate moral or psychological insight. It was based on the idea as essentially a rational animal, of man as essentially a rational animal, by which I mean the doctrine that every individual human being is an animal capable of reason. So far as any given man develops the capacity and becomes actually, and not potentially, reasonable, he makes the success of his life, according to the Hellenic idea. He becomes a force in political life, and a maker of history, according to the Hellenistic Roman idea. He becomes capable of living wisely, sheltered behind his own rationality in a wild and wicked world. Now, the idea that every agent is wholly and directly responsible for everything that he does is a naive idea, which takes no account of certain important regions in moral experience. On the one hand, there is no getting away from the fact that men's characters are formed by their actions and experiences. The man himself, under Rome, is a heroine of his narrative. Wait. Sorry, I skipped a page. The man himself, undergoes change as his activities develop. On the other hand, there's the fact that to a very great extent, people do not know that what they are doing until they have done it, if then. The extent to which people act is with a clear idea of their ends, knowing what effects they are aiming at, is easily exaggerated. Most human action is tentative, experimental, directed not upon not by a knowledge of what it will lead to, but rather by a desire to know what will come of it. Looking back over our actions, or over any stretch of past history, we see that something has taken shape as the actions went on, which certainly was not present to our minds, or to the mind of anyone, when the actions which brought it into existence began. The ethical thought of the Greco-Roman world attributed far too much to the deliberate plan or policy of the agent, far too little to the force of a blind activity embarking on a course of action without foreseeing its end, and being led to the end only through the necessary development of that course itself. Subsection 11. Character of Greco-Roman historiography, substantialism. R.G. Collingwood's The Idea of History. If its humanism, however weak, is the chief merit of Greco-Roman historiography, its chief defect is substantialism. By this I mean that it is constructed on the basis of a metaphysical system whose chief category is the category of substance. Substance does not mean matter or physical substance. Indeed, many Greek metaphysicians thought that no substance could be material. For Plato, it would seem substances are immaterial, though not mental. They are objective forms. For Aristotle, in the last resort, the only ultimately real substance is mind. Now, substantialistic metaphysics implies a theory of knowledge according to which only what is unchanging is knowable. But what is unchanging is not historical. What is historical is the transitory event. The substance to which an event happens or from whose nature it proceeds is nothing to the historian. Hence, the attempt to think historically and the attempt to think in terms of substance were incompatible. In Herodotus, we have an attempt at a really historical point of view. For him, events are important in themselves and knowable by themselves. But already in Thucydides, the historical point of view is being dimmed by substantialism. Substantialism. I need to work on my diction. Or enunciation. Both. For Thucydides, the events are important chiefly for the light they throw on internal and substantial entities, of which they are mere accidents. The stream of historical thought, which flowed so freely in Herodotus, is beginning to freeze up. As time goes on, this freezing process continues, and by the time of Livy, history is frozen solid. A distinction is now taken for granted between the act and the agent, regarded as a special case of substance and accident. It is taken for granted that the historian's proper business is with acts, which come into being in time, develop in time through their phases, and terminate in time. The agent from which they flow, being a substance, is eternal and unchanging, and consequently stands outside history. In order that acts may flow from it, the agent itself must exist unchanged throughout the series of its acts. For it has to exist before this series begins, and nothing that happens as the series goes on can add anything to it or take anything away from it. History cannot explain how any agent came into being or underwent any change of nature, for it is metaphysically axiomatic that an agent, being a substance, can never have come into being and can never undergo any change of nature. We have already seen how these ideas have affected the work of Polybus. We have sometimes thought to contrast the unphilosophical Romans with the philosophical Greeks, and we may thus have been led to think that if the Romans were as unphilosophical as all that, they would not allow metaphysical considerations to affect their historical work. Nevertheless, it was so, and the completeness with which the practical and hard-headed Romans adopted the substantialistic metaphysics of the Greeks does not appear in the Roman historians alone. It appears with equal clarity in the Roman lawyers. Roman law, from beginning to end, is constructed on the framework of substantialistic metaphysical principles, which influence its every detail. I'll give two examples of how this influence appears in the two greatest Roman historians. First, in Livy. Livy sets himself the task of writing history of Rome. Now, a modern historian would have interpreted this as meaning a history of how Rome came to be what it is, of how Rome came to be what it is, a history of the process which brought into existence the characteristic Roman institutions and molded the typical Roman character. It never occurs to Livy to adopt any such interpretation. Rome is the heroine of his narrative. Rome is the agent whose actions he is describing. Therefore, Rome is a substance, changeless and eternal. From the beginning of the narrative, Rome is ready-made and complete. To the end of the narrative, she has undergone no spiritual change. The traditions which Livy relied projected such institutions as augury, the legion, the senate, and so forth into the very first years of the city, with the assumption that they had remained thereafter unchanged. Hence the origin of Rome, as he describes it, was a kind of miraculous leap into existence of the complete city as it existed at a later date. For a parallel, we should suggest to imagine a historian of England assuming that the Hengist created a parliament of lords and commons. Rome is described as the eternal city. Why is Rome so called? Because the people still think of Rome, as Livy thought of her, substantialistically and non-historically. Secondly, in Tacitus, Fernot pointed out long ago that when Tacitus describes the way in which the character of a man like Tiberius broke down beneath the strain of empire, he represents the process not as a change in the structure or conformation of a personality, but as the revelation of its features in which it had hitherto been hypocritically concealed. Why does Tacitus so misrepresent facts? It is simply out of spite in order to blacken the character. Is it simply out of spite in order to blacken the character of the men whom he had cast for the part of the villains? Is it in the pursuance of a rhetorical purpose to hold up awful examples to point his moral and adorn his tale? Not at all. It is because the idea of development in a character, an idea so familiar to ourselves, is to him a metaphysical impossibility. A character is an agent, not an action. Actions come and go, but the characters, as we call them, the agents from whom they proceed, are substances, and therefore eternal and unchanging. Features in the character of Tiberius or a Nero, which would only appear comparatively late in life, must have been there all the time. A good man cannot become bad. A man who shows himself bad when old must have been equally bad when young, and his vice is concealed by hypocrisy. As the Greeks put, it, arche andera andera andera. He puts in so much Greek stuff that I don't know how to read. Power does not alter a man's character. It only shows what kind of man he already was. The Greco-historian biography can therefore never show how anything comes into existence. All the agencies that appear on the stage of history have to be assumed ready-made before history begins. They are related to historical events exactly as the machine is related to its movements. The scope of history is limited to describing what people and things do. The nature of these people and things remaining outside of this field of vision. The nemesis of this substantialistic attitude was historical skepticism. Events, as mere transitory accidents, were regarded as unknowable. The agent, as a substance, was knowable, indeed, but not to the historian. But what then was the use of history? For Platonism, history could have a pragmatic value, and its idea of this as the sole value of history intensifies from Isocrates to Tacitus. And as this process goes on, it produces a kind of defeatism about historical accuracy and an unconscientiousness in the historical mind as such. Part 2. The influence of Christianity. 3 great cities have occurred. Subsection 1. The leaven of Christian ideas. 3 great cities. 3 great crises have occurred in the history of European historiography. The first was the crisis of the 5th century BC, when the idea of history as a science, a form of research, and historia, came into being. The second was the crisis of the 4th and 5th centuries AD, when the idea of history was remodeled by the revolutionary effect of Christian thought. I have now to describe this process and to show how Christianity jettisoned 2 of the leading ideas in Greco-Roman historiography. Namely, 1. The optimistic idea of human nature. 2. The substantialistic idea of eternal entities underlying the process of historical change. 1. The moral experience which Christianity expressed contained as one of its most important elements a sense of human blindness in action, not a fortuitous blindness due to the individual failure of insight, but a necessary blindness inherent in action itself. According to Christian doctrine, it is inevitable that man should act in the dark without knowing what will come of his action. That inability to achieve ends clearly conceived in advance, which the Greeks call amartia, missing one's mark, is no longer regarded as accidental, but as a permanent element in the human nature, arising out of the condition of man as man. This is the original sin upon which St. Augustine laid stress, and which he connected psychologically with the force of natural desire. Human action, on this view, is not designed in the view of preconceived ends by the intellect. It is actuated by a tergo, by immediate and blind desire. It is not only the uninstructed, vulgar, it is man as such. It is man as such that does what he wants to do instead of thinking out a reasonable course of action. Desire is not the tamed horse of Plato's metaphor. It is a runaway horse, and is the sin, to use the technical terminology, into which it leads. Let me reread that section. It is a runaway horse. And the sin into which it leads us is not a sin which we would deliberately choose to commit. It is an inherent and original sin proper to our nature. From this it follows that the achievements of man are due not to his own proper forces of will and intellect, but to something other than himself, causing him to desire ends that are worth pursuing. He therefore behaves from this point of view, from the point of view of the historian, as if he were the wise architect of his own fortunes. But the wisdom displayed in his actions is not his, it is the wisdom of God, by whose grace man's desires are directed to worthy ends. Thus the plans which are realized by human actions, such plans, I mean, as a conquest of the world by Rome, come about not because men have conceived them, decided on their goodness, and devised the means to execute them, but because men, doing from time to time what at the moment they wanted to do, have executed the purposes of God. This conception of grace is the correlative conception of original sin. 2. The metaphysical doctrine of substance in Greco-Roman philosophy was challenged by the Christian doctrine of creation. According to this doctrine, nothing is eternal except God, and all else has been created by God. The human soul is no longer regarded as a past existence ab aeterno, and its immortality in that sense is denied. Each soul is believed to have a fresh creation. Similarly, people and nations have considered collectively are not eternal substances, but have been created by God. And what God has created he can modify by reorientation of its nature towards fresh ends. Thus, by the operation of his grace, he can bring about development in the character of a man or people, of a person or people already created. Even substances, so-called, which were still tolerated by early Christian thought, were not really substances, as substances has been conceived by the thinkers of antiquity. The human soul is still called a substance, but is now conceived as a substance created by God at a certain time and depending on God for its continued existence. The natural world is still called a substance, but with the same qualification. God himself is still called a substance, but his character as a substance is now regarded as unknowable, and not only undiscoverable by unladen human reason, but not even capable of being revealed. All we can know about God is his activities. By degrees, as the leaven of Christianity worked, even these quasi-substances disappeared. It was in the 13th century that St. Thomas Aquinas threw overboard the conception of the divine substance and redefined God in term of activity as actus purus. In the 18th, Berkeley jettisoned the conception of material substance, and Hume the conception of spiritual substance. The stage was then set for the third crisis of European historiography, and for the long-delayed entrance of history as at last a science. And that is where I'm ending today, page 48 in R.G. Collingwood's The Idea of History. I'll now check the comments real quick, and then I will peace out. Always strange comments on this thing. See y'all later.